Hi guys, and welcome back to Peculiar Pets. Today we're going to have a little chat about substrates. Now, substrates are one of the most divisive areas of our hobby. Some people love loose substrates, some people hate it. Usually the people that hate it do it because someone on the internet told them to hate it, and it's all based on kind of outdated myths and that kind of thing. Loose substrate of all different types can be very, very useful for enriching your animal's environment, for providing all kinds of different surfaces and textures for the animal to mess around with. And some of them, like the bottom row, are very important for raising humidity as well, to make sure that our animals have the right relative humidity in their environment. So we'll start with my two favourite substrates for arid animals, and that is Beardy Life and Leo Life. Now, they're both very similar products, and to be fair, we often tell customers it's basically the same thing with different coloured sand. It kind of is. They're basically a sand, soil, clay mix, and when they sort of come out of the bag, they're slightly damp. This can raise the humidity in your enclosure, and that's absolutely fine, even for things like bearded dragons and leopard geckos. A spike in humidity is not going to hurt them. It dries out once the heat lamp's on. Beardy Life in particular is quite sandy, and it ends up kind of looking like it does on the bag there, where it's kind of like a rocky desert effect. Leo Life, a little bit more clayey, and when they're both damp, you can actually make sandcastles out of them. Highly recommend that. They're both really good for digging, and they're both really good for recreating kind of arid environments, so scrubland, grassland, and then true desert as well for certain species. So we look at using these for things like bearded dragons, leopard geckos, Rankin's dragons, Uromastyx. They're actually really good for hognose snakes as well. I've raised quite a few hoggies on these, and they absolutely love burrowing into it. They'd be really good for rosy boas, really cool for certain king snakes, like your Mexican black king snakes that are found out sort of a bit further into drier areas. Californian king snakes would do really well on these. Californian kings are found in a massive range of habitats, so they will pretty much take any substrate you give them. But that's the sort of sand-soil mixes. There's a few myths about sand and soil, is that it can be swallowed and cause impaction, and that's going to be a recurring theme with all of the substrates that we talk about today. As long as the animal is kept at the right temperature, with the right lighting, with the right supplements, and is hydrated and fed an appropriate diet, the animal can ingest and pass small amounts of pretty much any of these substrates. There are a few substrates that are massive exceptions to this, so things like calci sand, corn cob, and the herby veg type things that people use for tosses, which are like a compressed grass pellet. Those substrates we don't stock, but I will mention them sort of as we go along as well. So Beardy Life and Leo Life. There's also the Habitat Bearded Dragon substrate, Habitat Leopard Gecko substrate. Pets at Home do their own version of this. It's all basically the same stuff. I personally just prefer the Pro Rep range. I find that the consistency on these and the mixture on these is really easy to work with, and the animals seem to do really, really well when kept on these. Another one of our drier substrates is Lignocell. Now, Lignocell kind of overtook aspen bedding, but aspen bedding is just as fine to use. We tend to use this for corn snakes, king snakes, bull snakes, milk snakes, pine snakes, gopher snakes, all the kind of North American or temperate snake species that we'd be keeping in the hobby. So a lot of you rat snakes will do really well on this as well. Lignocell is, in my opinion, slightly better than aspen in that it doesn't mould very easily. So if it gets wet, it does clag together and it sort of clumps up, but you don't get that manky black mould that grows on aspen, which, especially when we're using racks for younger snakes, is really important for us so we can keep them clean, even if they do decide that they need to tip the water bowl up. Lignocell is easy to clean, it's relatively cheap, it looks quite nice when it's in there, it doesn't look very natural, and I think that's the only major downside to Lignocell, is it's a very functional, relatively pretty substrate, but it's just not a very natural looking substrate. So for any of the species that I've just mentioned there that would do well on Lignocell, most of them would actually do well on that as well, even down to like corn snakes. We'd have to add a few things in for certain species, but sand and soil mixes can be used for a lot of species that would also do very well on Lignocell if you prefer a slightly more sort of clinical approach to keeping. It's a little bit easier to spot clean, a little bit easier to sort of fully clean out. You don't have the same dust that you do on things like the sand soil mixes, but it's a really functional substrate, really easy to work with. It does stick to your clothes. That is my major gripe with Lignocell, is it sticks to everything. So if you use that, it will get all over your house at some point as well if you're not careful with it. I've also found that it's really good small mammal bedding. I've started using this for my rats about 2 years ago, and it works brilliantly. It keeps the smell down because it doesn't mold when it's damp. If the water bottle drips on it or anything like that, it doesn't cause any problems. It's just been a really good all-round substrate to use in store. Moving on to the more humid substrates, so for things that are going to need moisture in their environment. Starting off with orchid bark, or bark chips as pro rep call it. Orchid bark is kind of a staple, long-standing substrate in the hobby, and it has a lot of different uses. If it's slightly dried out, it can work just fine for all kinds of different temperate species and slightly arid species. But because it doesn't mold when moisture is added to it, it's really good for animals that need that higher humidity or a humidity cycle. So there's a water dragon on the packet, and to be fair, it's really good stuff for water dragons, although I would definitely add soil to it if you're looking at using it for lizards. We tend to use it mostly for things like royal pythons, boa constrictors, carpet pythons, rainbow boas, but again, add a bit of soil. But as a really good basic humid substrate, you can't really go wrong with orchid bark. We tend to recommend the fine grade, but it also comes in a coarse grade as well, which I find the water drains through that a little bit, so you don't get the same release of humidity. You tend to just start making puddles in your enclosure. But it's an attractive substrate, it's quite versatile, and it is quite cheap to use as well. So for starting out with things like royal pythons, any of the sort of subtropical into tropical species, orchid bark would be my recommendation there. There's again, same sort of thing people talk about, whereas if it's ingested, it's not digestible, which is partly true. But again, if a piece sticks to a rat and your royal python swallows a bit, it's going to just come out the other end, as long as the snake's being kept correctly, hydrated properly, and all the usual stuff that you should already be doing for your animal as well. Moving on to a slightly different humid substrate. Now, I've had to kind of fudge this a bit. This is jungle bedding, but it's meant to be pro rep for BioLife Forest, but I can't actually find it. I think I've sold out, so that'll be back in on the van in the morning. But there's a range of what they call bioactive substrates, and they're all a variation on soil mixes with bark in there. Some have sand in there as well. The BioLife Forest has moss, orchid bark, coconut chips, I think there's activated carbon in it, and then a soil base to it as well. So they're really, really good for things that need much higher humidity. Now, there's an amphibian on the bag for this, and that's probably where these substrates are most used, is amphibians, some invertebrates, or if people are wanting to go down that bioactive planted setup for things like the crested geckos, the gargoyle geckos, and that kind of area. It can be used really well for things like blue-tongued skinks. They love burrowing around in this stuff. And I quite like mixing the BioLife Forest or jungle bedding with orchid bark for things like royal pythons or Brazilian rainbow boas, where we want a little bit more humidity throughout the day, or rather throughout the evening for those guys. And again, it's just a very versatile substrate that can be mixed with a lot of different things, used for a lot of different things, and it's really attractive. A lot of the bioactive substrates look really, really natural. You can plant live plants into them as well, so they'll grow for you. You can cover them up with leaf litter, which we'll get to in a second. And you can really go really all out and make a really natural looking tropical environment. There are some dry bioactive substrates on the market. There's Arcadia Earth Mix Arid, there's ProRep BioLife Desert, I believe it's called. Haven't had as much luck with those. They're not a bad substrate by any means, but I've never really found a solid use for them that they don't already do a bit better. So yeah, lots and lots of different soil mixes out there, lots of different uses for them, but they're all really good substrates. Same thing again, you'll hear people saying that those kind of substrates are dangerous if they're ingested. And the same rules still apply if the animal's fed correctly, lit correctly, heated correctly. Chomping on the odd little bit of soil is not going to cause them any major issues. These three substrates kind of all come together, and they're all a bit, none of them really work on their own. So EcoEarth, being the little brick just there, is a coconut fibre that you basically mix with water. Most people just soak it in a washing up bowl or in a bucket or something and let it expand. It does absorb moisture really, really well, and it does release humidity really well. The issue that I have with EcoEarth on its own is that once it's dry, it becomes very dusty. Now, for a time, EcoEarth was pushed as a really good soil alternative for things like leopard geckos. Thankfully, that's fallen out of favour because it's just not designed to do that. It's designed to be used wet, so it's brilliant for invertebrates. Tarantulas love digging burrows in it. Small amphibians love digging into it as well. I find EcoEarth the most useful, one as a nesting substrate, so you can put it in egg boxes, in humid hides for leopard geckos, all that kind of stuff. As long as it's enclosed and it stays wet, it's a really good substrate, especially for letting females dig down to lay their eggs into. It's most useful, I find, in a vivarium situation when you mix it with orchid bark or with a soil mix. I think on its own it just dries too quickly, it gets a little bit compacted down, so you end up with this kind of solid layer of just coconut fibre. Whereas mixing something through it like the bark chips or the soil mixes just gives it a little bit of aeration, stops it compacting, and it also stops it then stagnating as well when you're watering it, because you can just pour water into EcoEarth once it's been made for the first time, rather than spraying it like we would with the orchid bark or the soils. Similarly for sphagnum moss. Now sphagnum moss you can buy dried, you can buy it live. I prefer it live because it comes in that resealable bag and it'll just keep going for ages for you. Sphagnum, again, isn't really a standalone substrate. It's something that we mix into other things. Now, sphagnum can be really good as a top layer, and you can use it alongside leaf litter as well. And both of these two substrates kind of work together. So if we have leaf litter mixed with moss on top of a nice deep soil mix, we can then grow plants in that. If we're going bioactive, our cleanup crew has somewhere to live and to hide, and they'll also eat the decomposing leaves and little bits of dried up moss as well. Moss is really good for nest boxes, it's really good for humid hides, and you can just keep re-wetting it as it dries out. Even if it goes yellow and it's dead, it still absorbs moisture, so you can get a long time out of even a 1.5 litre bag like that. Leaf litter, same sort of thing. You want to mix it through something or use it as a top layer to hold the humidity into your soil base. But leaf litter can go on pretty much any of these. So we tend to, every autumn, we get a load of leaf litter from outside and we boil it all up, and then we use it in a lot of our enclosures. And we use it for everything from corn snakes through to leopard geckos through to the amphibians that would actually naturally have sort of damp leaf litter and stuff. And the difference in the animals is quite noticeable. They like foraging around in it, it makes an interesting noise, it's different textures. It just makes their environment that little bit more enriching for them. So leaf litter is a bit of a go-to for everything, but it's not something that you have to use. But if you're using any of the bioactive substrates or orchid bark as kind of a humid base, you can add leaf litter on the top and it will keep that moisture further down in your substrate for you. So I hope that's kind of helped you all pick out of some of the substrates that we stock in store. There are more that we do. There's a few variations on these as well. Like I say, the jungle bedding is a nice product, but I do prefer ProRep BioLife to that. Orchid bark, there's also things like cypress mulch you might see now and then in shops. Tends to be a ZoomEd product, so it tends to be a little bit more expensive than the orchid bark, but it is a really nice product to use. Same for Lignocell, you might see aspen in shops instead. Absolutely fine. Let's just have a quick chat about some of the substrates that we don't stock and why we don't stock them. So the big one for me is coconut fibre is a long-standing substrate, and it's tried and tested and it has its uses. Not all the uses it's ever been used for have been great, but we can still find good uses for it. Coconut chip, on the other hand, I'm not a big fan of. Now, it's become really popular recently with royal python keepers, especially royal python breeders. Coconut chip is the same sort of product where you soak it in water to get it to be humid, and then you would re-water it as it dries out. In a rack system, so for breeders that are using racking systems, for shops that are using small racking systems to keep hatchling snakes in, coconut chip has its place, and it does work. But because the majority of our customers are using vivariums for their animals, we tend not to keep coconut chip on the shelf. Tend to find that in a vivarium setting, the heating and the extra ventilation tends to just dry it out that bit too quick, unless you're using a really, really deep layer of it. But as part of a mix for something like a more humid substrate, so mixing it with orchid bark, moss, maybe mixing it through a bioactive substrate, coconut chip is a really useful thing for that. But as a standalone, I'm just not sold on it, so I just don't bother pushing it to customers. There are a few brands that we can get if people are absolutely desperate for it, but it's just not something that we tend to recommend to people because there are just better alternatives out there. Another kind of on the subject of alternatives that we don't stock, we don't really do sand. So there's desert sand, there's calci sand, there's a couple of different Exoterra kind of sandy soil ones. There's a really good Exoterra one that we just can't seem to get back in stock at the minute, and it's called Stone Desert, I believe, and it comes in black, and it's one of the most attractive desert substrates out there. It's a little bit dusty and a little bit messy, but the lizards love it, and it looks really, really cool, but I'm struggling to get that in stock at the minute. Calci sand we don't do because it is just a genuinely unsafe substrate. You are encouraging your animal to eat a supplement, basically. It's made out of calcium carbonate, which is exactly what we're putting onto the bugs. If the lizards eat small amounts of it, it's not going to make any difference, they're just going to digest it. But because it's made of something that the animal knows it needs, we could be encouraging a behaviour called geophagy, which is basically rock eating or earth eating. Geophagy is the intentional eating of substrate, and with any of these substrates, if your animal decides it wants to eat mouthfuls of it, you're going to run into problems. But with calci sand, because there is a biological reward to swallowing large amounts of it, the animals can become conditioned to do that and almost start self-supplementing. So as a rule, we do not recommend or stock calci sand, and the dyes that they use to turn it hot pink and aqua blue and all that, I'm not convinced that that's safe. They stain the animals, which was the biggest thing for us. So many years ago, we just stopped selling it completely, and we wouldn't recommend that you use it for any animal at all. And then similarly, again with Lignocell and these two, corn cob. Now, there will be shops that will swear blind that corn cob's fantastic and that they sell it to all their customers and it's great. That's absolutely fine. If it works for them, it works for them. My biggest issue with corn cob is that if it gets wet, it expands. And when it expands as well, it grows this really interesting mould that can be anywhere from green through to black, and it grows it like overnight. Because it expands when it's wet, if it's ingested accidentally, it expands in the stomach of the animal, and that can then cause intestinal blockages. So when we're talking about things like impaction is a real thing, but using the wrong substrate or the wrong heating, the wrong light tends to be the list that we reel off for people. Corn cob for me falls into that why test the limit kind of thing. It is made out of a food as well. It is corn. So as much as it doesn't look very appetizing, it's something that an animal, especially something like a bearded dragon, who is watching us, something like a bearded dragon might intentionally start to eat that, just thinking, oh well, it tasted all right, I'll have a go. And if that then expands inside them, it's going to cause a lot of problems, no matter how hot they're being kept, because it's just not designed to be swallowed, and a lot of animals can't digest corn anyway. So it all just seems like a little bit of a marketing ploy, and I've seen problems on corn cob where it doesn't support the animal's joints. So that's very similar to beach chippings as well, which is a substrate we don't really use anymore. I never really disliked it too much, and before the dawn of the sand soil mixes, it was kind of an alright alternative to things like mixing your own sand and soil, but it just doesn't provide the same support because it's very loose, and corn cob falls into that as well. Underfoot, it shifts too easily, so the animal's not supported, their joints aren't getting the right support, and that long term can cause problems. And that's been sort of noted by vets as well, that bearded dragons in particular that aren't given the right sort of substrates to move around on, it can start to affect their joints in later life, which is why we don't recommend things like tile, lino, shelf liner, newspaper, unless it's for sort of medical and quarantine reasons. So yeah, they're kind of the main ones that we don't do. So yeah, that's basically a very quick rundown on substrates. Obviously, if you have any questions, or if there's a substrate I didn't include that you think is really, really good, or some that I didn't include that you think should be mentioned as being particularly bad, or if you disagree with any of these recommendations, I am happy to hear it. You're welcome to comment and tell me what you think. So yeah, that's it from me. Thank you very much, guys. Bye-bye.